Welcome to the Talent Teach podcast. This episode is about trauma, what it is, how it affects students' behavior, and what we as teachers can do to support students with trauma in our classrooms. My name is Jamie Ottevanger, and joining me today is Aleks Palanac, Head of Santuary at the University of Leicester. Before we get into the conversation, it's good to note that Aleks and I are teachers, not psychologists or mental health professionals. We are sharing our understanding of trauma based on our experiences in the classroom. Please take this conversation as inspiration, and if you want to know more, check out the sources linked in the description of this episode. Hi Aleks, how are you?
Hi Jamie, very well, thank you, and thanks for asking me along today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Aleks Palanac, and I work as Head of Sanctuary Seekers Unit at the University of Leicester in the UK. And I have a background in ESOL and academic English teaching.
Okay, what does Head of Sanctuary entail? What do you do exactly?
Basically, I work to develop ways to widen participation for refugee background students to enter the university. So I work to develop things like scholarships and also pathways into university, especially focusing on English language pathways. So over the years, I've been doing some work in looking into trauma-informed ESOL pedagogies to try to support students who are on those English language pathways.
So you work mostly with older students, university aged?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So ranging from 18 years old to any years old, really, to people in their 60s.
Oh, even up to their 60s? Wow.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
Wow.
Because with refugee background students, I mean, first of all, they can tend to be a bit older because they might have missed some years of education. They might have had interrupted education. But also, even people who are much older might want to kind of re-qualify to do something else in their country of resettlement. So yeah, we do get people of range of different ages.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning because my experience with trauma is from the children that I work with that are sometimes refugee background and sometimes bring trauma into the classroom, but it presents very differently in different children. So can we start at the very beginning? What is trauma? How would you define it? How would you explain it?
A good way of looking at it is as an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident or a natural disaster or conflict. And then immediately after the event, it's quite common for people to feel a sense of shock and denial. But then some people go on to experience longer term reactions, such as unpredictable emotions and flashbacks. And then for some people, these feelings continue and then they can have difficulty moving on with their lives. It's a kind of continuation of this trauma response. And trauma can it affects different areas of the brain. So first of all, there's the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with rational thinking. So when that is affected by post-traumatic stress disorder, then people become less able to regulate their emotions, such as fear responses. And then we have the hippocampus, which shrinks as a result of trauma. And that has a negative impact on memory and the ability to differentiate between past and present. That affects things like flashbacks, which can feel like they're happening in the present moment. So they feel very real. Yeah. And then there's another area of the brain that's affected called the amygdala, which becomes hyperactive and kind of acutely wired for survival. And then people can struggle to switch this off. And then there's kind of additional daily life stressors which refugees tend to experience, which can also serve to combine with all of those other factors to create that chronic stress. So yeah, it's quite a kind of complicated interaction of all those different things.
Yeah, because once, of course, they leave the traumatic situation and they come here to the Netherlands, or in your case, to the UK, their problems aren't solved.
No, that's the thing, and also because of the nature of forced displacement. So people might have experienced, let's say, somebody has been displaced because of war. So it's not just that potentially traumatic event which will affect them, but also the result of having to move can mean that they've had to leave family behind, which is like their support networks. They might have had to leave their job, and the kind of financial security and the kind of social networks that come with that. They might also kind of lose their sense of identity, because they've had to come to a different country and start again. And quite often they're not able to, for many reasons, including kind of perhaps not having the proficiency in the language and not having the right qualifications. They might not be able to go back into a profession or the vocation that they were doing before. So all of those things can serve to make people feel kind of disconnected, disassociated, and can kind of contribute to that trauma.
Yeah. So it's good to know, I think, that the trauma does have a physical effect on the brain, because some of the behaviors that result from a trauma can be quite challenging. And I've heard comments in the style of, they just need to adjust. They just need to listen to what I'm saying. Can you talk about why it doesn't work that way? Because my experience is that it doesn't. And I found that as a teacher with those kinds of situations, the more I tried to be strict, the more resistance I would meet. So, can you talk a little bit about why they won't just adjust, or why being strict doesn't help?
Well, the thing is, with trauma is that the children or adults can't help the things that they are experiencing. So, for example, like I mentioned before, they find it difficult to differentiate between past and present, which means that they can have things like panic attacks and flashbacks, and they can be kind of re-experiencing things and really feeling like they're experiencing those things in the present moment. And if they were experiencing traumatic things in the present moment, then it would be natural to have certain extreme reactions, like perhaps anger or extreme anxiety and extreme fear, jumpiness, that sort of thing. So it's important to kind of recognize that the reactions that people have are normal in their situation, when their situation is that they feel like they're going through something right at this moment. And there are kind of other things that people with PTSD can do as well, like in order to kind of protect themselves, kind of like defense mechanisms. So things like shutting down, becoming emotionally numb, disassociating, sometimes things like rocking and fidgeting. So it can feel like someone has kind of completely withdrawn. And again, this is not something like a discipline issue. It's not something that you can discipline out of someone. It's just the kind of natural response to what they're feeling. It's a way of protecting themselves. I mean, there are other things as well, which you might notice. So things like poor concentration and memory, perhaps avoidance behaviours as well, you might notice. So things like not wanting to work with other people, or maybe specific people, not wanting to talk about certain topics, not wanting to engage in certain activities. Sometimes things like absence and lateness as well might be kind of ways of avoiding a certain situation. So again, all of this is a way of protecting themselves. And yeah, and heightened stress levels, heightened alertness, perhaps fear of risk taking, like not wanting to take part in an activity because it feels risky, kind of speaking out in class in front of people and things like that. So yeah, so kind of it's useful to reframe these things not as discipline problems or lack of motivation, but as survival mechanisms, and then responding to that appropriately rather than trying to discipline someone for these things.
And another thing I read about this is that you have to understand that the children or people don't have control over these responses. Is that a correct way of looking at it?
Yes, exactly. So basically, yeah, we have to understand that this is not something that is necessarily within their conscious control. So we know that when we ourselves are in a potentially dangerous situation, you have more adrenaline and you're on kind of hyper alert, and you sometimes make decisions that you wouldn't necessarily make if you were relaxed and calm. And that's similar to what, people who are experiencing trauma will be going through.
Yeah. Okay. So good to know, summarizing, that it does have a physical effect on their brain, and their responses while challenging are not in the control of the student or the person experiencing it. That's a challenge for teachers, though, because sometimes the behaviors are really unacceptable. They can be rude to the teacher, or even threatening the teacher or classmates, or becoming physically violent, or just become very disruptive. So, on the one hand, we want to be understanding because this is not something that they control. But on the other hand, there are other children in the class that also need to be taught. So, what can you do?
Well, I would say that for trauma survivors, one thing which is very helpful is to have a sense of structure and to have boundaries. So whilst on the one hand, there are certain things that we might need to be more flexible about, like taking into account the fact that they have experienced trauma. On the other hand, actually, it can kind of enhance a sense of safety and kind of helping them know what to expect, which can help them feel a little bit more in control of a situation. So actually having boundaries, having clear ground rules is a very helpful thing. I mean, to be honest, it's helpful for most people, like, and particularly children. I mean, children tend to benefit from having clear structure and boundaries anyway. But if they are a trauma survivor, then that's even more the case. In terms of these children being kind of threatening and disruptive and sometimes physically violent, and especially when it comes to a point where they're, likely to hurt somebody else, then certainly they need to be told firmly, what those boundaries are.
Yeah. So, apart from having like rules and boundaries and being very clear, I noticed too in my classroom that it helps to be super repetitive. So every lesson transition is in the same way. Every day the schedule is on the board. It's repetitive, it's predictable, and still, sometimes somebody will go into this triggered reaction. So, what if you have someone yelling at you or threatening classmates? What do you do? How can you, as a teacher, help them stop those behaviors in that moment?
So there are certain de-escalation strategies that you can use if somebody is, for example, having a flashback or having a kind of angry episode and that sort of thing. So, I mean, the first thing to think about is you as the teacher and as the helper need to kind of remain calm and kind of take deep breaths and try not to be too kind of outwardly emotionally affected by what's happening. And then trying to make eye contact with that person and moving slowly towards them, but still giving them space at that time. So not being kind of threatening in the way that you're approaching them. And then you might then want to kind of move closer to them and say their name and tell them that you're approaching them, tell them that that they're safe. And you might want to kind of, as you approach them, kind of give them a stronger sensory stimulus and maybe say you're going to touch them on the arm now. And then you would try to kind of remove them from that situation if possible and kind of take them to the side and see if you can kind of talk to them about what has happened and about why they have responded in a certain way, and kind of just giving them some time and space away from the situation if you can. I mean, I realize with children this is quite difficult because you may have a whole class load of other children who need attention, and you may not have another adult in the classroom to be able to tend to them. So it's certainly kind of more challenging in that situation than it would be, if you had a class of adults. So just basically, if it's possible, kind of trying to give them some time out, some breathing space, so that they can kind of feel in control of their recovery and kind of coming back to themselves. Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned before, like if this has happened in a whole class situation, then it hasn't just affected that one student, it's affected the other students as well. So you may need to kind of debrief the other students and kind of calm them down as well. So there's that element to think about too.
Yeah. You just said talk to them about what's happened to them. And I think for adults, that's definitely possible because you can explain to the adults what trauma is and how it's affecting their brain and what is happening to them. But I think even for children, it might be helpful so that they understand what's happening to them and that they can learn strategies to cope. And I also think you make a good point about talking to the other children as well, because in my experience, usually where problems occur is during free situations or a playtime. And if you can explain to the person involved, look, you were very angry, and I know why, and this is what you should try and do next time. And to the other children too, like, yeah, this is how they respond sometimes. And when they do, we need to take a step back and let them be. I will go to him, and you guys give him some space.
Yeah, it's a good idea, I think. If that has happened to a child, then maybe once they have calmed down, maybe to ask them, okay, what? I mean, obviously they may not be aware of their own feelings or of what is best for them, but they might be. So it's kind of worth asking them, what would help you in that situation, or if you feel upset again in the future, would you prefer A, B, or C? Would you prefer to have an opportunity to sit outside, to sit in a quiet room for a few minutes, or to sit with a friend, maybe, or to do some colouring or something? So maybe to give them a choice about, what they think would help them in that situation to calm down.
Yeah.
Because that then gives them a little bit of agency, and also it fits in with the idea of giving people structure and predictability, because if they know that that is something that's likely to happen if things go wrong again, that they kind of know what to expect, and it's not too scary.
Yeah, exactly. I read somewhere else, or I think I've heard it in another podcast about trauma, that it can be helpful to offer children like a space where they can be alone for a little bit. And I think what they meant was a physical space. So give them a corner or an empty room. That might not be available in every school, but what I think is also possible, again, from my own experience, is to have children just not be alone in a room if that's not available, but maybe give them some headphones and a laptop with music to listen to, and they can kind of shut themselves off from their surroundings in that way. Because we have had students that did that. They would be able to participate in the morning portion of class, but then after a few hours it would be too much and they would not be able to cooperate anymore. And like I said, it didn't matter how strict we were because it would just lead to more resistance. What actually helped was to let them choose an activity that they wanted to do. And so for the first weeks, even, I think, the afternoons they just spent listening to music on their laptop. And at first we were like, "Oh my gosh, this is such a cop out. We're just we're just letting them do this because we don't know what else to do." But now as I'm reading about trauma, I think actually that was the way to go.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because you're kind of, if this is something that is coming from the students, that they need some space, and this is something that's helping them feel like they have some say, some agency in what they're doing, and that they're telling you what they need, and they feel like people are listening to them, and it's a way to feel safe, to shut out overstimulation in the environment, then that sounds like a really good strategy. It's not realistic to expect children who have been through trauma to just kind of slot in to a regular class timetable and for everything to be absolutely fine. There's always likely to be some adjustments which are required. And yeah, it might take some time, but the time that they are using their headphones will gradually be phased out, and they will eventually be able to engage in the rest of the lessons like the other children.
Yeah. Because what happened here was after a while, they would listen to their laptop, but scoot their chair closer to a classmate and just kind of peek out of the corner of their eye, peek at what we were doing. And then over time, one of the earbuds came out and they would listen in And they literally phased into the activity where in the end we would say, oh, I noticed you're not looking at your laptop. Would you like the page that we're doing? And it doesn't matter if you don't do anything with it, but would you like a worksheet of your own? And so slowly but surely they started participating.
I mean, that sounds perfect. So taking it at their own pace, they have agency, they have choice. Um, yeah, I mean, and this is the way that they can feel safe enough to then start to engage gradually.
Yeah. Can you say anything about the time that would take? Because that is a concern. I don't know if this is typically Dutch, but the way it works for us, for newcomers, is when they come to school, they get 1 school year of sheltered Dutch instruction before they go to the regular classroom. So we have a school year, it's 40 weeks. And then when the first month or two is spent sitting on a laptop, we think, oh my, they're not going to be able to do what they need to do before they have to move on. So how do you balance that? What do you say about the time students need versus the time you actually have in the classroom?
That is a good question. And it sounds like you've got some very real kind of limitations to work within. I can't actually answer that question because I don't really have the experience of working with children, traumatized children as such. So I'm not sure how long it would take. All I can say is that you have to kind of take it at the child's pace, because trying to make them go faster than they can is likely to be counterproductive.
Yeah. Force them to do something they can't, it would just make it worse.
Exactly, yeah. And then it's likely to put pressure on them to make them feel anxious. And if they feel anxious, then yeah, that is going to then backfire, because then they don't feel like this is a safe space for them.
Yeah. Give them the time they need.
Yeah, basically. I mean, on the upside, it sounds like that's a good system that you've got, though. The fact that they have like 40 weeks of a kind of intensive like transition period, that does sound like a good system. That's something that we don't have in the UK, as far as I'm aware.
I don't think it's everywhere because I have friends that are teaching in different parts of the country and they will just get newcomers into their regular classroom. So I know from that experience that it's not everywhere, but there is quite a big network here of schools, or at least there's whole schools that are dedicated to this, to newcomers education. Or what also happens is, like in my case, it's 1 or 2 classrooms within a regular school.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to look into that when it comes to the UK, but that does sound like a really good system.
Yeah.
Whether it's the whole school or whether it's a couple of classrooms within a school.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because recently I read a post on Facebook by some educational research organization. And what they do is teachers can send questions and they will provide a research based answer with the papers that they used. And the question was, is it better for newcomers to be in that sort of sheltered program, or should they join the regular class immediately? And one of the things they mentioned was that it can be beneficial to be in a regular class immediately because if you put all the newcomers together, they don't have anybody to model fluent language except the teacher. And it's harder to create a language rich environment if nobody speaks a word of the language you're trying to learn. So they said it could be better to have them in a regular classroom immediately. And I thought to myself, sure, because we do also have children from expat families that have had good education. They are already multilingual, they are literate, and they would actually be fine. But we also have children that are 8, 9, 10 years old and they've never even been to school. So there is no way they would function in a regular classroom at the level that they're expected to.
Yeah, you're right. Different kids are in different situations. I mean, and for some kids, it might be useful to have both things going at the same time, maybe a couple of days a week in one of the kind of intensive transition programs, so that they have a sense of a group of people kind of not being alone in their experiences of transitioning, but then maybe 3 days a week in a mainstream classroom, so that they, as you say, so that they can have models to kind of follow. Yeah, but yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'm sure the answer is different for different children in different situations.
Yeah. We've been talking mostly about children that show behaviors that are very outgoing, shouting, being disruptive, being violent even. But there's the other end of the spectrum too. There's children that would just shut down, maybe? Can you talk about that? What kind of behaviors are those, and how can we help those children?
Yeah, so as you say, some people might end up shutting down as a way of protecting themselves from things which might hurt them, like topics, experiences, potential trauma triggers, and that again is a natural kind of trauma response. Some children might kind of numb themselves down, so you might find that they really have trouble expressing emotions of any sort. So this is the thing with numbing. It's not just the negative emotions that get numbed, but it's also positive emotions. So you might notice that they're just very kind of flat and cannot experience enjoyment in different situations either. Dissociation as well. So not necessarily kind of seeming like they are in the room following what's going on, just kind of withdrawing from a situation. Maybe it would look like they are daydreaming or something. What you can try to do in this situation is to try to ground them and try to get them back in the room. So there are kind of various ways that you might do that. So you might play a multi-sensory game or something, or do an activity which involves different senses, not just sight, but also hearing, maybe speaking, or maybe singing, maybe something kinesthetic as well, like clapping or getting them to physically move. So that can be useful. Also, you could do a simple activity which is called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is basically asking them to name 5 things that they can see, 4 things that they can touch, 3 things that they can hear, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. Smell and taste aren't always very easy to do, I must say. It depends where you are and what you're doing and if you're eating something or not.
During snack time, they can definitely do it.
Yeah, snack time. So yeah, that's something that you can possibly do. I mean, there are a number of variations on these sorts of themes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, or you could simply get them to kind of feel the weight of their bodies in their chair and let the feet on the ground, type of thing. Breathing exercises, or I know a teacher who has done some kind of light yoga with their students in the class. I mean, literally just some kind of simple stretches that you can do from standing position. So again, yeah, it's just something which brings in the whole body. It's like a holistic, multi-sensory thing that can help people who are feeling kind of numb and disassociated.
To kind of bring them into the present. Because you just said they might not feel like they're even in the room. And I remember that because I've had children that gave me the idea that they had no idea what we were doing. They were happy. They seemed happy. They were not numb like you described, because they would laugh and smile and play. But in the middle of an instruction, they would get up, wander to the arts cupboard, get some paper and markers, and would just start drawing. And I would be so surprised because I thought, wow, like, I'm talking to you too. There's 15 kids around you sitting down listening, and it doesn't occur to you that that's what you're supposed to be doing. So that's interesting. But yeah, so these grounding exercises bring them into their bodies, bring them into the room. That helps. Another thing I noticed with children that might be a bit withdrawn is that they have difficulty retaining information. So we would learn a skill on Monday, and on Tuesday it would be like I'm presenting something totally new to them. Can you talk about how we can support learning specifically with children that show this kind of behavior?
That's a very tricky one, and that's something that I've noticed in adults as well. That sometimes, like one day, maybe I've covered the passive voice in class, and then the next day, a student who seemed to have been taking it all in and able to kind of use that grammatical form, the following day, they seem to have forgotten everything. So yeah, this sort of variable ability and sort of amnesia that you might come across in some students. In this situation, I would say that good practice in regular teaching, which would be kind of doing extra repetition of that point, and perhaps getting them to learn that point in a sort of multisensory way, to try to reinforce it through the different senses. So not only through reading, but maybe saying it aloud, maybe doing it in a role play, but as many different ways as possible is likely to be helpful in this situation. Again, I mean, it depends on the severity of the trauma. So if someone is going through a really kind of acute phase of kind of trauma symptoms coming back, then it's possible that these strategies might not be enough, and that you might just have to give them time and then come back to it when they're ready to absorb this. There are certain things that we can try, but it's difficult to battle very, very intense trauma if somebody just is not receptive and not ready to take that information in. So it's important to kind of let that person know that actually we can come back to this later, and that to kind of take the pressure off them a bit if they're going through a really difficult time.
Yeah, I think so too, because then they might not be able to retain information, but they will notice that they're not progressing like the rest of the children in the class. And I think kids are very sharp to this. They know that they're doing something else than the rest of the class, and I'm sure it works the same for adults.
Yeah. And I think the key in that situation is to just reassure them, to reassure them that their mental and physical well-being is more important than the thing that they're supposed to be learning right now. Yeah. And that if they need a little bit longer, that's okay. But that was an interesting point you made about people maybe feeling singled out or feeling like they are getting different treatment from other people. I mean, depending on your context, it might be suitable to say to all students in the class, we're learning this week. We know that some people might take a little bit longer. That's okay. We all learn at different rates. And sometimes it's appropriate to kind of incorporate that into the message that we tell all students in a class, which then means that the one student who we really want to say that to doesn't then necessarily feel singled out or different, which can be particularly important in certain kind of age groups of children.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to what you just said about when they have difficulty learning something, to involve all the senses and to make it more sensory. So what I've also found to work is that I go down to the, not kindergarten.
Yeah, foundation.
Yeah. So to go to the foundation department of your school and get some of the games and activities that they do, because I have found that for some children that come in, and even though they might be older, 6, 7, 8 years old, when they are learning to write, they also like to draw in the sand and to work with clay. And I noticed that, for example, when we paint, some children are making a brown blob. They cannot paint, but they are covered up to their wrists in paint, and they're feeling the paintbrush and they're rubbing their hands together with the paint. So all that kind of sensory play that you would think is for a 4 or 5-year-old, it could work for older children too, and I think it helps.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's possible, depending on what the child has been through, and also whether they've, it's quite possible that they've missed education or some of those experiences at those kind of formative ages. So it's possible that they have developmental delays, which might explain why they respond so well to that. It's like multisensory experiences as well.
Yeah. And what I mean is, it's not only so that they enjoy it, even though they do, but I think it can help them, like you just said, bring them into their body, be aware of their senses. It's almost like a mindfulness exercise.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, all of this, the kind of grounding activities, coming into the present, coming into, both temporally and also kind of spatially, is very much related to mindfulness, which obviously is something that a lot of people are kind of embracing at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, so let's recap. We've talked about what trauma does in the brain. We've talked about the kind of outward behaviors, outbursts, violence, but also the withdrawn behaviors and what you can do as a teacher. Final question for you. If teachers want to know more about this and how to help students, where can they find more information?
Well, I've kind of put together some thoughts into an article for English language teachers, which is called Towards a Trauma-Informed ELT Pedagogy for Refugees. So that kind of gives a kind of accessible overview of lots of things that we've talked about today, including things like making the classroom into a safe space, And also something that we haven't really touched on, but which involves not forcing personalization in the classroom, like not asking direct questions, which kind of forces somebody to have to talk about their personal life, like their family and their home and things like that. So there are some kind of insights in that article about that. If you wanted to have a more general overview as to what trauma is and, you know, how it presents and how it can be treated, then I would recommend a book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. That is a really good and comprehensive book. And there's also a book by Judith.Herman called Trauma and Recovery. It kind of brings together domestic abuse and also war trauma. So it brings together trauma in the kind of interpersonal domain with trauma in the context of war, and it brings together parallels. It's quite a fascinating and really useful read.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because we've been talking about trauma from the perspective of newcomers, but trauma is a lot more prevalent than you might think, because it's not just for children that have come from war. A lot of children and adults are going through things in their lives that are traumatic, that are not necessarily related to war or being a refugee. And I think the CDC in the United States did a study, and they asked people, how many adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, have you been through? And I think, I don't remember the exact number, but it was around 60% of people indicated that they've been through one traumatic experience. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing. Yeah, when you start digging into it. And this is why the area that I've been focusing on has been trauma-informed pedagogy for refugees. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the insights that have kind of come from that research can be applied to really any cohort. It's like, you know, like dyslexia research and the strategies that they say that you can apply to people with dyslexia. So quite often inclusion specialists say, actually, these strategies will work, a good practice with any cohort.
Yeah.
It just so happens that it will particularly benefit the students with dyslexia, but actually they will benefit all students.
Yeah.
And I would say the same, by and large, I would say it's the same for trauma-informed pedagogy, partly because we don't actually know who in our classes may have experienced what. And so, yeah, there may be many more children and adults who have experienced trauma than we can ever guess. When it comes to refugee cohorts, we know that the prevalence of trauma is higher within refugee cohorts just because of the nature of the things that might have made them flee and the things they might have experienced along the way, and the nature of kind of loss and displacement. So we know that trauma is more prevalent in that cohort. But yeah, I mean, anyone who we meet might have experienced trauma, and it may not be immediately apparent.
This is good information to have for teachers of newcomers and refugees, but it's good information to have for all teachers, because it might change your perspective on certain children. You know, the difficult student, they might not just be being difficult. They might need the same strategies, or they might be going through something that you don't know about.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think trauma-informed pedagogy gives us a framework, kind of like a lens through which to see our children, our students, and it gives us more options and flexibility in how we then choose to respond, rather than assuming that a behaviour is down to discipline issues, for example.
Yeah. To go back to they should just listen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So the two books you've mentioned, those are easy to find. Where can we find your article?
Well, it was published in Language Issues by an organisation called Natekla, but I can send you the link, and I don't know if you have show notes, then you could always put the link there.
Yeah, I'll add the links in the description of this episode. Final thoughts. Is there anything else you wanted to add or recommend?
If the people who are listening are English language teachers, there's also a really good book which is a bit broader in scope. It kind of looks at positive psychology in English language teaching, and I think it's called Positive Psychology in Second language acquisition.
Okay.
And it's a very good book which covers lots of different things like motivation, determination, grit, the benefits of helping others, like sharing knowledge with others, teaching others. It kind of covers a whole host of things which relate to positive psychology, which is very important also when it comes to helping people recover from trauma, because it's not all about mitigation strategies. It's also about how can we now help people reconnect, grow, thrive, those sorts of positive things, so that they can become whole again. That book is it gives a good insight into that.
All right. Those are some good sources. Okay, well, thank you so much, Aleks, for your thoughts and your ideas. It's been really good talking to you about this.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that was it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the Talent Teach podcast. You'll find links to the article and books Aleks mentioned in the description of this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the Talent Teach podcast in your favorite podcast app and you'll never miss an episode. You can also follow Talent Teach on Instagram and check out talteach.com for more information and materials for teaching newcomers. Thank you for listening. Until next time.